They thought he was just another suspect, until he told the judge who he really was. It started on a rainy Tuesday morning in Jefferson County, Missouri. A quiet courtroom, nothing special about it. Wood-paneled walls, scuffed linoleum floors, and the faint smell of old coffee and paper. You know the kind. It was the kind of place where stories get buried under noise. But that day, something different walked in. He didn't shuffle or slouch. He walked with purpose, back straight, eyes forward. A sharp gray suit, no wrinkles, clean shoes, polished like glass. 52 years old, give or take. Salt and pepper beard trimmed close. Not a man trying to prove anything. Just a man walking through nonsense like he'd done it 100 times. His name was Marcus Ellison, and he was in handcuffs. Most folks in the courtroom didn't recognize him. To them, he was just another black man with a record, someone who had acted out and now had to answer for it. The officers sitting near the back, 2 deputies, young guys who looked fresh out of academy, chuckled when they saw him. "Look at this one muttered, elbowing the other. "Thinks he's on Wall Street or something." The other leaned in, smirking. "Yeah, probably read half a law book in jail and now thinks he's slick." Neither of them noticed the way Marcus scanned the room. Not scared, not confused, just watchful, like he'd been here before, like he already knew what this place was about. He was brought before the judge, Judge Ronald Beck, a white man in his early 60s with a habit of not looking defendants in the eye unless they were already someone he respected. He barely glanced up as Marcus stood there. "Defendant is charged with obstruction of justice," the clerk read out. "Incident involved non-compliance during a lawful traffic stop and verbal interference with an officer's duties." The courtroom was silent. Even the air felt stiff. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Ellison, do you have legal counsel present?" Marcus's voice was calm, steady. "I'd like to waive that right and speak for myself, Your Honor." A low murmur rippled through the room. People shifted in their seats. The deputies in the back scoffed again. Judge Beck looked up for the first time and studied Marcus. "You sure about that? These are serious charges." "Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware." The judge shrugged. "All right, you'll get your chance. But first, let's hear what the prosecution has to say." That's when the assistant district attorney stood, Rebecca Tinsley, young, ambitious, and clearly prepared to make quick work of what she thought was an open and shut case. She described Marcus as combative, said he refused to exit his vehicle during a routine stop, claimed he was aggressive in tone, and tried to direct officers on how to perform their duties. Said the officers feared for their safety because of how he escalated the situation with unnecessary questioning. Throughout it all, Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt, didn't even twitch. He stood like a man listening to a fairy tale written by someone who didn't know the truth. But you could feel it. Something wasn't adding up. The details were too clean, too rehearsed. The whole courtroom was staring at this well-dressed man in handcuffs, wondering how his image fit the charges. One of the deputies whispered again, not so quietly this time. "Hope he remembers how that suit looked when he's back in orange." And that's when Marcus turned his head, just slightly, and looked directly at them. Not for long, just long enough to make them shut up. But the real story hadn't even started yet. The hallway outside the courtroom wasn't much quieter than inside. A couple of officers leaned against the vending machines, swapping stories about the combative suit guy. Others hovered near the glass doors, shaking their heads like they'd seen it all before. Inside, Marcus sat at the defense table, hands free now, but resting still, like they didn't belong to someone about to defend himself against criminal charges. His posture was quiet confidence. Not cocky, not fake, just sure. The deputies, Officer Troy Keegan and Officer Blake Harmon, were now seated toward the front, both looking a little too smug for 2 men who were supposed to be impartial. The courtroom bailiff walked over and leaned toward them. "You 2 arrested him, right?" "Yeah," Keegan said, chewing gum like it was a performance. Didn't even raise his voice. Just kept asking us for badge numbers and department policy. Real cute. One of those know your rights guys. Harmon laughed. "Yeah, he kept saying stuff like, 'I'll be filing this,' and 'you're out of line.' Like he knew something we didn't." The bailiff chuckled with them. "I've seen that type. They always fold when the charges stick." And behind them in the gallery sat a black woman maybe in her 40s. Denise Hall. She'd come in quietly and sat alone, hair tied back, phone off, eyes fixed on Marcus. She hadn't looked away once. The DA wrapped up her opening statement with a flourish. She pointed to the so-called body cam footage, which unfortunately suffered technical issues during part of the stop, and emphasized the officer's professionalism despite verbal antagonism. Classic. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, walked up to the front like he wasn't just defending himself, like he was about to teach a class. "I want to begin," he said clearly, "by reminding the court that traffic stops don't give officers the right to ignore procedure, to misrepresent facts, or to escalate unnecessarily." The judge shifted. "Mayor Ellison, keep it specific to your case." "I am." He turned toward the gallery, looking right past the officers and their grins. "I was pulled over on Route 141 at approximately 6:13 p.m. I asked the officers why I was being stopped. I was told my taillight was a little dim. Not broken, not out, just dim." He let that hang in the air a moment. "I then asked for clarification calmly on what the officer meant. I asked if I was being detained or if I was free to go. I asked for badge numbers. I informed them I was recording." Keegan snorted from his seat, but Marcus didn't break pace. "They asked me to exit the vehicle. I asked what law required me to do that, given the reason for the stop. I told them I wasn't refusing. I just wanted clarification." The judge held up a hand. "And then?" Marcus took a breath. "Then I was pulled from my car, pushed against the hood. My phone was knocked to the ground. One of them, I won't say which yet, told me to stop acting smart and just take the ticket like a man." That silenced the room. You could feel the tension shift. The chuckling stopped. Even the judge leaned back a little, just enough to show he was starting to pay real attention. "I didn't resist. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten anyone. But somehow, I ended up in handcuffs, facing charges, standing in front of you today." He looked at the DA. "I've reviewed the incident report. I've seen how the language was shaped to justify the arrest. Words like non-compliant and verbal interference don't reflect what really happened." The courtroom was holding its breath. Marcus returned to his seat, quiet again, but Officer Keegan leaned to Harmon and whispered, "Man's got a script. Too bad it won't save him." And just then, Denise stood up in the gallery. She reached into her purse, slowly and clearly, and held up a sealed white envelope. She handed it to the bailiff without a word and sat back down. But that envelope? That changed everything. Judge Beck narrowed his eyes at the envelope like it might explode. He waved the bailiff over, who brought it to the bench. "What is this?" the judge asked. The bailiff glanced down. "It's addressed to the court, signed by the Department of Justice." That got a few heads turning. Even the stenographer paused. The judge carefully opened the envelope, pulled out a typed letter with an official watermark, and began reading silently. His eyebrows twitched. Then his lips moved a little, as if reading it again to make sure he wasn't misinterpreting it. Finally, he cleared his throat and looked at Marcus. "Mr. Ellison, do you want to explain this?" Marcus stood again, slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. That letter contains a copy of a sealed authorization issued to me 3 weeks ago by the Department of Justice. It confirms that I was operating under directive as part of an internal investigation." The courtroom stirred. Marcus continued, "I've recently been appointed Deputy Director of Internal Affairs at the FBI. I was conducting a covert field review of routine traffic stops in the region following a spike in civilian complaints, particularly from marginalized communities." The room went dead silent. No smirks, no whispers, just open mouths and shifting chairs. Officer Keegan looked like he'd swallowed a battery. His partner Harmon blinked fast, like trying to reverse time by sheer willpower. Marcus looked at the judge. "I wasn't just pulled over. I was targeted. I asked questions officers are trained to expect. I followed every protocol, and I documented every second of it." The judge still hadn't blinked. "Is there video?" "There's backup footage. My personal device was synced to cloud storage. That recording is now in federal custody. There is also surveillance footage from a business nearby. You'll find it matches every word I've spoken here." The DA, Rebecca, finally broke her stunned silence. "Your Honor, I was not informed of any federal involvement in this matter." "You weren't supposed to be," Marcus said. "The purpose was to observe unfiltered behavior, not filtered responses to a badge." Judge Beck was quiet for a long second. "And the arrest report? he finally asked. Fabricated, Marcus replied, or at best, creatively written. Denise, still in the back row, nodded slightly. She'd worked at the DOJ for almost 20 years. She'd been the one to suggest Jefferson County for the audit. The judge turned to the DA. I want to see the footage. All of it. I want to know exactly how a federal agent operating under DOJ directive ended up facing criminal charges in my courtroom. Rebecca stammered. Yes, Your Honor. I'll retrieve everything immediately. The judge turned toward the officers. Keegan, Harmon stepped forward. The two men rose, slow and rigid. The room watched them walk like they were heading toward a guillotine. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I don't care if you thought he was just another suspect, he said. I care that your report now looks compromised. I care that your behavior in this courtroom, in front of me, in front of this man, who was doing his job, tells me more about your judgment than any paperwork. Keegan opened his mouth. The judge raised a hand. Save it. You'll be speaking to internal affairs now, not me. Marcus returned to his seat without a word. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just looked over at the officers and then away. Rebecca turned back toward him. Mr. Ellison, It's done, he said quietly. The tape will speak for itself. He wasn't there for revenge. That was never the assignment. But Denise? She had tears in her eyes now. She knew what it had taken to even get someone like Marcus inside that courtroom undercover. She knew how dangerous it was, how easily it could have gone wrong, and it almost had. But the court hadn't seen the footage yet, and some people still weren't ready to believe what it showed. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Local news crews had caught wind of the mystery defendant, and the whispers about Marcus Ellison's true identity had grown louder overnight. Two officers sat alone at the back now, Keegan and Harmon. No more whispering, no gum chewing, just silence and tight jaws. Judge Beck came in 5 minutes late, unusual for him. He looked tense, but more awake than usual. As soon as he sat, he got straight to the point. We've reviewed the footage submitted by the Department of Justice. We've compared it to the arrest report and statements made by the officers involved. He paused, scanned the room, and looked directly at Marcus. What we saw, he said slowly, was a man conducting himself with composure, asking legitimate procedural questions, making no physical threats, offering no resistance, and being treated with increasing hostility until he was forcibly removed from his vehicle. You could hear a pin drop. Judge Beck turned to the prosecution. Miss Tinsley? Rebecca stood. She looked less polished than yesterday, blouse a little wrinkled, eyes puffy. Your Honor, I want to formally withdraw the charges against Mr. Ellison, and I will be filing a motion to review the original report submitted by the arresting officers. The judge nodded. Good, because as it stands, there is a serious discrepancy between reality and what those officers put to paper. Marcus didn't react, not even a blink. But Denise let out a small breath of relief from the back. She'd been holding it since the night before. Then the judge looked at Marcus. I'd like to apologize on behalf of this court. Marcus tilted his head but said nothing. I've been doing this job a long time, the judge went on. And somewhere along the way, I stopped expecting people like you to show up here with the truth already in your corner. That's on me. Still, Marcus didn't answer, because that wasn't the point of any of this. The judge turned back to the room. As for the officers involved, their conduct will be reviewed by federal investigators, effective immediately. This courtroom will no longer be handling this matter. It is now in the hands of the DOJ. Gasps and murmurs filled the gallery. The reporters scribbled fast. The local deputy leaning by the door took 2 steps backward. Then, out of nowhere, Officer Harmon stood up. I want to say something. The judge raised an eyebrow. This isn't your time to testify. I know, Harmon said, his voice cracking a bit, but I need to say it anyway. Judge Beck didn't stop him. I thought I was just doing my job. I thought if someone asked too many questions, they were stalling or trying to bait us. I didn't think... He glanced at Marcus. I didn't think someone like him could really be watching us for a reason. I didn't think about why he kept asking for badge numbers. I just saw someone who made me uncomfortable and assumed that meant he was a problem. Marcus didn't move. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't need to, because the message had already landed. It wasn't about Marcus being FBI. It was about how quickly people made assumptions. and how dangerous those assumptions could be. Judge Beck finally looked toward Marcus again. "You're free to go." Marcus nodded once, calm as ever, no grin, no glare. He walked out of that courtroom the same way he walked in. Straight back, eyes forward, unbothered by the noise behind him. But the headlines that came after, those were anything but quiet. By noon, the story had made national news. Man in courtroom shocked officers. Turns out he's FBI. Jefferson County officers under investigation for profiling high-ranking federal agent. FBI, deputy director, mistaken for suspect during routine stop. Social media ate it up. Memes, hashtags, debates on every platform. Some people were shocked, some were angry, and others said, "This is exactly why we don't trust the system." Marcus, meanwhile, was back at his temporary office in St. Louis, sitting at a small desk with nothing more than a legal pad and a black coffee. He wasn't watching the news. He didn't need to. Denise came in and placed a manila folder on his desk. That's everything from their department. Internal complaints, filed or ignored for the last 2 years. Marcus flipped it open. "Same names come up?" "Too often," she said, "but this one's bigger than those 2 deputies." He nodded. "Always is." She hesitated at the door. "You think they'll keep their badges?" "Probably not, but I'm not after their jobs. I'm after their patterns." That night, Marcus met with his supervisor, an older man from D.C., who flew in just to talk in person. Director Samuel Granger had been in law enforcement for 40 years. The kind of guy who saw through nonsense before it had time to form. "You handled that better than I would have," Granger said, leaning back in the leather chair. "You could have embarrassed the whole department in front of the media. You didn't." Marcus gave a small shrug. "Wasn't the point." Granger took a sip of water. "You know how this ends, right?" Marcus looked at him. "How?" "They'll focus on the surprise, the title, the fact that you were FBI the whole time. They'll miss the reason you were even pulled over in the first place." Marcus gave a half smile. "Then we remind them." Granger smiled too. "That's why I put you in this seat." He reached into his bag and handed Marcus a file. "This one's yours. Next location's in Indiana. Bigger department, more layers. You ready?" Marcus looked at the folder, then back up. "I've been ready." Meanwhile, back in Jefferson County, things were falling apart faster than expected. Internal Affairs launched a full investigation. Several officers were suspended pending review. Civilian complaints that had been lost started reappearing. One officer resigned before the week was out. Another lawyered up. As for Keegan and Harmon, they had separate interviews with DOJ investigators. No uniforms, no badges. Just empty hands and excuses that sounded thinner every time they were repeated. But the real damage wasn't to their careers. It was to their image. That smirk they wore in the courtroom, gone. Replaced by the quiet understanding that they were no longer untouchable. And the community, they weren't staying silent anymore. A local pastor held a town hall that weekend. Dozens came, some with stories, others with phones full of videos. None of them surprised by what had happened to Marcus, only by the fact that for once, someone powerful was watching. A woman stood up during that meeting, voice trembling but strong. "My son was arrested last year for resisting just like that man, except he wasn't FBI. He didn't have a camera. He didn't get his day in court like that." Silence. Then a man in the back stood. "But maybe now someone's listening." And that was the part nobody saw coming. 1 week later, Jefferson County looked different. The sheriff held a press conference, said all the right things, words like integrity, accountability, disappointment. But his voice cracked just slightly when he said, "We are cooperating fully with federal authorities." Because he knew, everyone knew, this wasn't just about 2 officers. This was about a department and a culture that had been coasting unchecked for years. In a small diner off Highway 30, the same deputies who once laughed in court sat in a back booth with their heads low. They weren't wearing uniforms anymore, just sweatshirts and ball caps. A couple of regulars stared at them, but didn't speak. Keegan stirred his coffee, didn't drink it. "You think we'll do time?" Harmon shook his head. "No, but we won't get back on the force. Not here. Maybe not anywhere." They both stared out the window. "I didn't know who he was," Keegan muttered. Harmon rubbed his face. "That's the problem, man. You only care now because you found out who he was. Across town, Denise stood outside a community center with Marcus. A group of young volunteers had invited him to speak. Not as the FBI guy, but just as a black man who had walked through a fire and refused to burn. He didn't say much, didn't give a lecture or rattle off credentials. He told a story. He told them what it felt like to be handcuffed for asking questions, what it felt like to be calm, right, and still treated like a threat. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just laid it out flat. And when one teenage boy raised his hand and asked, "How do you not get mad?" Marcus looked him dead in the eye and said, "Oh, I get mad. I just use it. I don't let it use me." The room was quiet after that. Nobody blinked. Even the adults in the back were listening. Later, Denise walked him to his car. "You think it'll change anything?" she asked. Marcus opened the door, glanced back at the center. Maybe not everything, but it changed something. And that's how it starts. She nodded, then hesitated. "You sure you want to keep doing this undercover stuff? You've got a seat at the top now." He smiled, but not the happy kind. That seat never changed anything from the top. It only looks powerful if you don't know what real power is. He got in the car and drove off. Not to DC, not to some press junket, but to the next case, the next quiet town, the next stop where someone thought a badge gave them the right to twist the rules, the next place where someone needed to be reminded, not every black man pulled over is defenseless. Some are watching, and some have the power to act. Meanwhile, back in court, Judge Beck had started reviewing old cases, ones he barely remembered, ones that started to look different now that the curtain had been pulled back. He pulled one file, then another. Same officers, same vague language. He set them aside, for review. For once, he was looking past the ink, because once you've seen the truth, pretending it never happened, that's no longer an option. 3 months later, the courtroom looked the same, but people saw it differently now. The county had a new oversight committee, civilian-led, monthly reviews. Officers were required to attend, not just to listen, but to speak, to answer, to be present. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. Officer Keegan now worked private security at a shipping warehouse outside of St. Louis. No badge, no gun, just a clipboard and a radio. He didn't talk much. People didn't ask. Harmon moved out of state, tried to start over, but the name was out there now, and every interview asked about the Marcus Ellison incident. He stopped applying after the 5th one. As for Judge Beck, he started showing up to community events, not because he wanted to be seen, because he realized he hadn't been seeing. He'd stopped assuming. He started reading cases differently, slower, with more weight. Some people still said Marcus embarrassed the department. Others said he exposed it. But the people who understood, they said he did what needed to be done. And Marcus, he didn't stay in the spotlight, didn't write a book, didn't go on a speaking tour. He stayed quiet, moved in silence, kept going, because there were other towns, other departments, other people getting dismissed for speaking up, getting punished for asking the right questions the wrong way. You know the kind. There's a lesson buried in what happened. Not just about race, not just about power, but about assumption. About how fast people decide who you are before you say a single word. About how easy it is to ignore a man's truth when you think you already know his story. Marcus never needed the room to like him. He needed them to listen. And when they finally did, not because of his badge, but because of his evidence, his calm, his facts, the room changed. Because they didn't see him anymore as just a black man in a suit. They saw the gap between what they believed and what was real. And when that happens, that's where change starts. So next time you feel yourself writing someone off before you know them, pause. Ask why. Ask what you've been taught to see, and then decide if you're looking or just assuming. Because if Marcus taught us anything, it's this. Respect doesn't come after a title. It should come before you ever ask for credentials. If this story made you think about justice, respect, or the power of staying calm when the world wants you angry, share it. Start the conversation. We can't change what we're not willing to talk about, and we can't fix a broken system until we see how it breaks people in silence. Speak up, stay aware, and above all, don't assume.